Hello everyone. It's been a while. I kind of took a impromptu hiatus, so apologies about that. It's been a long, I don't know, like month now. I just had a lot of personal stuff and I was sick for a couple weeks, didn't have my voice, all that stuff. So, I meant to do this episode earlier back when Daredevil Born Again first came out, which speaking of which, I'm not the only one that is back. Daredevil is back. Charlie Cox and Vincent D'Onofrio are both back as Daredevil and Kingpin in the Disney Plus Daredevil Born Again series. It's kind of a revival series slash semi sequel to the Netflix series, which is awesome. It's been really good so far. At this point, we only have like a couple episodes left, but yeah, so today I'll be talking about the comic storyline that inspired the name Daredevil Born Again back in '84, I think, and I'm gonna kind of connect it to the Daredevil Netflix series because even though the Disney Plus series is called Born Again, it's more referring to the actual story in the show about Matt becoming Daredevil again. Whereas the actual adaptation of the Born Again story arc was in season 3 of the Daredevil Netflix show back in 2018. And it is kind of it is more of a loose adaptation, so I'll be kind of talking about the similarities and the deviations from the comic that the show goes into. But before that, of course, I'm going to talk about the actual comic, give my thoughts, and kind of break it down for y'all. Before that, I do want to talk briefly about some new comics coming out. Oh yeah, also got my Daredevil fit here. You can sort of see it. There we go. So yeah, some newer comics. I mean, there are a few that are coming out. I'm not gonna break down like everything. There's new issues of Absolute Batman, and there's this new Fire and Ice series coming out, and there's new like action comics, Uncanny X-Men: The Ultimates. The one that's really of note is there is a new Amazing Spider-Man series. They're relaunching Amazing Spider-Man again. Seems like they kind of do this like every few years at this point. There's not a whole lot of info about this new series besides it's kind of like a quote unquote like new beginning type thing, like they do with every new story run, new comic run. But this is written by Joe Kelly with art by John Romita Jr. And if you weren't a fan, if you're a Spider-Man fan that didn't really like Zeb Wells' run, maybe hop on this, see if you like it. Joe Kelly kind of wrapped up the last Amazing Spider-Man series. I think Zeb Wells left at like issue like 60 or yeah, like 50 something. I don't remember, but Joe Kelly and a few guest writers closed up like the last story arc in the last run. So, yeah, if you want to hop onto the new Spider-Man series that's probably going to end in like 50 issues. It's coming out this Wednesday. So, there you go. Yeah, so let's just get into Daredevil Born Again comic series here. So, Daredevil Born Again, but most people know this was written by Frank Miller with art by David Mazzucchelli. Inker was David Mazzucchelli as well, and the colorists were Christy Shield and Richmond Lewis, and the letterer was Joe Rosen. And this story arc was released in the Daredevil comic series running at the time, which was between February and August of 1986, not 1984, like I said earlier. And it was released between issues 227 and 233. And I've actually I spent some time like the last few years like collecting all of the comics that are in the Born Again run, which is kind of cool. I mean, they're not worth an insane amount, but it's mostly just kind of like a personal goal, personal comic collecting goal kind of thing. I think I actually got this one first, and then I just sort of like built around that. And this one, the first issue, 227, is actually signed by. I got to meet Vincent D'Onofrio, and he signed that, which is pretty awesome. So, yeah. And what's also interesting about this book is technically it's like issues 227 through 231 that actually are part that were originally part of like the Daredevil Born Again arc, and then there's two issues like 232 and 233 that have become part of the arc in like published editions, but originally it was more just kind of like a sort of an epilogue type thing. But Obviously, I'm gonna cover all of those here in this breakdown here. So let's get into that. So the story picks up with Karen Page, and she's really down on her luck. She left Nelson and Murdoch to pursue acting, but things didn't go well. She got into adult films, and she's become a drug addict. And kind of on her last rope here, at the end of her rope here, she sells Matt's identity to some random guy just for like a quick fix. And somehow that information eventually makes its way to Fisk, and he kind of bides his time, fact checks it, makes sure it's legit, and then enacts his plan, which ends up being just kind of ruining Matt Murdock's life, starting with getting him audited by the IRS while his assets get frozen. His apartment's being foreclosed on, and he gets this cop to testify that Matt like did some shady dealing, so he's in trouble with the bar and the law and everything. So meanwhile, Matt's kind of been giving the cold shoulder to his girlfriend Gloria, so she ends up hanging out with Foggy, and they end up getting together. This isn't a huge part of the story, to be honest, but it's there. So Matt's struggling here, and he gets in his Daredevil costume, goes after the cop that testified against Matt Murdock. Threatening him doesn't really work, so he hangs around and listens to the guy call Fisk's men, and apparently this cop is named Nick, and apparently his son is sick, and Fisk bribed him, saying he was gonna pay for his son's treatment if he testified against Murdoch. Foggy ends up defending Matt in court and keeps him from jail time, but Matt gets disbarred, which should be a victory, but this is not enough for Fisk. As we know, Fisk in a lot of ways is a big, petulant man-child, so he sends his men to blow up Matt's apartment. And at this point, Matt just kind of thought he was a victim of bad luck, but now he knows that Fisk is behind it, and there's like this really cool line in the voiceover says, it was a nice piece of work, Kingpin. You shouldn't have signed it, which just goes hard as hell, in my opinion. So Matt's really not doing well. His mental health is declining. He barely has enough money to pay for this really crappy hotel room, and he just stays in bed for days. But then finally, he comes up with the bright idea to just go after Fisk and attack him. So he calls Foggy. Doesn't really make any sense. He thinks like Foggy betrayed him as well. His mental health isn't just really not there at all. And he kind of goes on this crazy rampage on the subway where these guys try to rob him. And then a cop tries to stop him, but he can't recognize who's friend or foe. He hurts the cop as well, takes his billy club, and he goes to Fisk's building and attacks him, but Fisk pretty easily overpowers him in the state Matt's in. And then Matt wakes up, and he is in a taxi that has been driven into a river, and they killed the cab driver with the policeman's club that Matt stole, and they covered Matt in alcohol to seem like he was just a drunk and he killed himself. But Matt manages to use some of the glass from the broken windshield to cut the seatbelt, and he gets the heck out of there. And he crawls out of the water and just like goes into an alley and just falls asleep with a bunch of homeless guys. And while he is asleep in this kind of almost coma, he has these memories of when he first lost his sight. He felt a woman visit him who he was pretty sure was his mother, and he feels this cross necklace on her neck. So that comes in important later. Meanwhile, the reporter Ben Urich is trying to get to the bottom of what's going on with Matt Murdock, because it seems to him that he's been set up. So he goes after Nick, the cop that testified against Matt, and figures out, his son's sick and everything. Back to Matt, he crawls out of the alley, but then he isn't, I almost said he isn't watching where he's going. He isn't listening where he's going. I don't know. He isn't really paying attention, and he gets hit by a car, which hurts him. And then he tries to stop Turk, with like some low-level criminal from, I don't know, doing Turk things, and Turk stabs him. So now Matt's got injuries from getting hit by a car and getting stabbed. So back in Mexico, where Karen has been this whole time, she's running away from Fisk's men because Fisk ordered that everyone who was involved with like the chain of information about Matt's identity has to be killed to tie up loose ends. So she gets involved with this guy named Paulo, this drug dealer, and Paulo agrees to take her to America, but she's basically got to be his girlfriend, kind of for the time. More of just there for sexual things. So back in America, Ben interviews Nick, the cop, whose son unfortunately died, and he's ready to tell the truth at this point. But before Ben can get him on the record, this nurse that was working at the hospital, who works for Fisk, breaks Ben's hand to send him a message, but then nearly beats Nick to death. Then Matt, who was gravely injured, had managed to limp his way to Fogwell's gym and collapses inside, and he's found by a nun and taken to a nearby Catholic church. And there he's being nursed back to health by all the nuns, specifically Sister Maggie, who found him. And there's definitely a lot of cool imagery here. If you're watching the YouTube version, there's like this image of Matt lying in the bed, but the way the wall is drawn and everything, it looks kind of like the crucifix. And Matt's got like broken ribs, stab wound, he's got pneumonia and a fever, so he's not doing well. At the Daily Bugle, Ben is being reamed out by J. Jonah Jameson because he won't pursue the Fisk's and Matt's story anymore because he's been scared off. And to make matters worse, he ends up getting a call from Nick, who survived, and he still wants to testify. He still wants to go on the record with Ben. But then that stinking nurse shows up again and strangles Nick to death on the phone with Ben. And that scares Ben even more. Karen, who has finally gotten to the U.S., manages to kind of escape Paulo, who isn't letting her go. He's like, "You're mine now." So she escapes, and she ends up talking to Foggy, meeting up with him, and she kind of confesses what's going on, not to like Matt's identity and everything, and she's very intent on finding Matt because she feels like Matt's the only one that can protect her at this point. But Foggy agrees to take her in and help her out. And then we see Ben, who finally steps up and is like, I'm not cool with this anymore, and he decides that he's going to write his story. Meanwhile, Fisk's men approach Melvin Potter, a costumer and an ally of Daredevil, and they want him to make a knockoff Daredevil suit. Back at that Catholic church where Matt's been recovering, he's finally awake, his fever's broken, and Maggie has given him this cross necklace she's worn, and he recognizes it as the same one of his mother that he recognized when he first lost his sight. And he asks Maggie if she's his mother, and she says no, but he hears her heartbeat, her heart skip, so he knows that she's lying. Once he's fully recovered, Matt begins training again to go after Fisk, and Fisk is trying to go legit with all these other businesses, but we all know he's a criminal at heart. So Ben Urich, after writing his story, goes to the police and tells them everything he knows about Fisk and the nurse and framing Murdoch and all that. And Matt goes outside and he manages to get his hands on a paper with Ben's article in it. And for those of you who don't know, even though he can't read, he can feel ink like on paper. His sense of touch is that good, so he's able to, quote unquote, read it. So Ben goes back to his apartment with a police escort because he's under police protection now. But the nurse, whose name is Lois, I didn't mention that earlier, who's working for Fisk, shows up at his apartment, tries to kill his wife, manages to overpower the policeman with Ben, and tries to kill Ben too. But then Matt shows up and beats the crap out of her, and Ben's able to save his wife. Ben then gets a call from Melvin Potter, but Ben kind of brushes him off because he's got more important things to worry about, like his wife. But Matt, he overhears it over the phone, so he goes to Melvin and gives him the okay to make the suit, and he'll just deal with Fisk's plan. And it turns out Fisk's plan is to take this insane guy from a mental institution, dress him in the Daredevil outfit, and have him murder Foggy Nelson and Karen Page, and frame it all on Daredevil. That is what happens, but there's some kind of complications because Foggy sees Paulo, who's tracked Karen down, and he calls the police. So there's a shootout between Paulo and the police. And then the insane guy in the Daredevil outfit shows up, but then Matt was there at Foggy's place, kind of waiting for him. So they fight, but Matt's able to pretty quickly overpower him, and he's able to save Karen from Paulo. And they are reunited. And even though like Karen tells him everything she did, he doesn't care at this point, and it really seems to kind of stabilize him mentally. So now we kind of get to the epilogue part of this, where this is kind of Fisk's like last ditch effort to get revenge on Murdoch. He uses his connections with a general to get this super soldier guy called Nuke to basically just attack Hell's Kitchen. So that comes a little later. Meanwhile, Gloria has become a photographer and is working with Ben Urich. So Ben goes to the county prison because the nurse that works for Fisk, Lois, has agreed to testify and say everything that she did that was messed up, all the illegal stuff she did. But unfortunately, there is a cop in there that shows up, and he ends up being Fisk's guy. He kills the cop, kills Lois, but Ben Urich is actually able to overpower and kill him before he can hurt him or Gloria. Over the last couple weeks, Matt has been working as a diner to pay for an apartment for him and Karen, and he hasn't been doing any Daredevil stuff. But then Nuke shows up in Hell's Kitchen and starts blowing things up and destroying all this stuff, and um, Matt realizes he needs to don his double D's again. So he does, and he fights Nuke, but Nuke's, this crazy super soldier guy, so he can't really like keep up with him physically. But then the Avengers show up. Oh, and there is this moment where Matt ends up blowing up the helicopter that brought Nuke in because it is also equipped with weapons and it's killing a bunch of people. And Matt uses Nuke's weapon to destroy the helicopter to save a bunch of people, but he ends up killing the helicopter pilot. And he's there. He says, "God forgive me," while he does it. But yeah, that was an interesting moment I'm going to talk about later. But yeah, so the Avengers show up and they bring Nuke to justice. But Captain America is suspicious of Nuke's origins because he's wearing a flag on his face and he's wondering if he really does work for the government, which he does. Then Captain America breaks his way into the military archives and he finds out that Nuke was in fact a super soldier made by the government and he still works for them. Meanwhile, Nuke kind of goes rogue. He takes a bunch of pills that give him the pills are basically meth, but he takes them and kind of goes crazy, goes on a rampage. But then Captain America shows up and fights him. Meanwhile, Kingpin is receiving some prestigious award, yada yada. While Captain America and Nuke are fighting, Daredevil is attacking a subsidiary of Kingpin's operations, and he overhears that Nuke and Captain America are fighting, so he joins the fray as well. But Nuke starts having like a heart attack from all the pills he took. So while Captain America is dealing with all the military police that show up to get Nuke back, Daredevil takes Nuke and tries to get him to a hospital, but he realizes it's going to be too late. So he brings Nuke, who's now dead, to the offices of the Daily Bugle so that they'll have evidence that the government used that Nuke is a government agent used by the government as a super soldier operative. So wrapping things up, a bunch of people start flipping on Kingpin. There's the evidence of Nuke working for the government, but then there's also one of the guys that worked for Fisk flips on him, one of the hitmen he hired, and a bunch of charges start coming in, and Fisk is able to brush a lot of them away and avoid jail time, but now like he's no longer a legit businessman because his reputation is tarnished. He's losing face with a lot of his business associates, and he's just not in a great place, especially considering his goal was to be a legit businessman. So the story ends with Matt and Karen seemingly happy together in Hell's Kitchen, and Matt is back to his normal self. He's kind of overcome the mental decline he experienced earlier, and that is the book. All right, so let's talk about this for a little bit. This is obviously a super iconic, probably the most iconic Daredevil story, and I mean it's great. What else can I say about it? I think there are some moments where it kind of feels like it lost itself a little bit here and there. I think the ending feels a bit tacked on, but it was always supposed to be kind of an epilogue. Like it wasn't supposed to be technically part of the whole arc originally, so I give it a little bit of a pass there. But yeah, overall, it's really good. I really like how it explores the mental decline of Matt and how he's just like losing his mind. And I really like stories where the villain goes after, like, just tries to destroy the hero's life in more ways than one. You know, doesn't just like try to attack them, but ruins their reputation, like gets them evicted, makes them lose all his money. Like, it's horrible, but it's a really, I think it's a really good. I feel like it feels more authentic because I feel like that's what people do more nowadays than just like, I mean, like in real life. I feel like that's what, criminals do who aren't like just trying to like off somebody. So I think, and it also kind of shows how meticulous and uh, sinister Fisk is. And also just seeing, I think what's really relatable with Daredevil as a character, I feel like in a lot of ways he feels like the most human of most, if not all, comic characters. Because I feel like most people who had all this shit happen to them, like one after another, getting evicted, losing all their money, losing their girlfriend, yada yada. I feel like most people would have a bit of a mental breakdown, and Matt definitely does. And what was interesting is he's Daredevil, so how does that work? He has a mental breakdown, but he's also an insanely skilled fighter. So he goes around punching cops and going after Fisk. I really like that exploration, and I really liked the part where Ben was going to interview. I really liked the Ben storyline. The reporter storyline. He's trying to uncover stuff, but he gets scared off by Fisk's men. But he eventually, you know, comes back to himself and pursues the story. And I really liked the part where he goes after Lois. He goes to interview Lois, and then there's the whole thing where Fisk sent somebody to off her before she can talk. I thought all that, it was all that felt very like a crime drama. I thought that was really cool, and like an investigative reporting drama type thing. I really thought that was cool. And I really did like the ending, mainly, like I said earlier. Okay, it's not so much that I like the ending, but I liked the part with Captain America in it. I really liked this one line he says. Let me find it real quick. Yeah, like when he's talking to the general to get information on Nuke, and he basically gets stonewalled, and the general, asks like we says we've always valued your commitment and your loyalty, and Captain America says, "I'm loyal to nothing, General, except the dream." And I think that's a really interesting, because I think a lot of people, regardless of their political ideas or anything, I think a lot of people see Captain America and think, since he's wearing the flag, that he represents and stands for, what America is, when really what he is loyal to and what he stands for is what America should be, like the ideal America, which obviously does not exist. That is what Captain America stands for. He doesn't stand for whatever bad crap that's going on in America right now. He stands for the ideals that that America should be striving towards. So I really liked that. I think Frank Miller really gets Cap in that respect, and also just him going and kind of going against the government to uncover Nuke's true origins. I think that really shows that he's not just like blindly loyal to a flag or whatever. And in a lot of ways, he's kind of juxtaposed to Nuke, who is just like a mindless drone of the state, and Cap has a mind of his own, and he has his own moral compass. And if the government does not live up to that moral code, he's gonna fight back, which I think is great. And we see in the comics a lot, and even in the movies, but I feel like some people lose sight of that or don't see that in him. Which, okay. But yeah, so a couple things I wish they explored more. I really wish they had explored Matt's mom. He just kind of figures out Sister Maggie's his mom, and then that's kind of it. She's not in this story for the rest of the whole thing, and kind of wish they had lingered more on that. And I wish they maybe lingered a little more, spent a little more time exploring like Matt's mental decline. He just sort of, loses his mind, and then he finds Karen again, defeats the fake Daredevil, and that's kind of it. He seems mostly okay after that. I wish they'd kind of explored more him, pulling himself out or getting help pulling himself out of that mental well he fell into. And I do wish that they had explored more of him killing that helicopter pilot. There is obviously a tinge of remorse there when he says, "God forgive me," but he is like Batman and Spider-Man. He does have like a no kill rule in general. He does break it sometimes in certain situations, but it's usually like a big deal and a big part of the story. And I think that is one of the things I like most about Daredevil is, even more so than like Batman, he feels more real. Whereas Batman, it just has like this code and he never kills, and even sometimes at the expense of other people, he sticks to his code. With Daredevil, you really feel the struggle with him and his code. Like he doesn't want to kill, he believes it's wrong, but sometimes either he has like a lapse of judgment, or he just like can't control himself, or in a certain time, like it's just like he feels like he has to kill to protect himself, things like that. I really like that they explore that more. I feel like in Daredevil comics, which I feel like a lot of Batman comics just get kind of like preachy about it, like this is the code and he never breaks it and blah, 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 and it's like, yeah, okay, I get it, like that's part of his character, but I definitely prefer the way most Daredevil comics kind of explore the whole like notion of a no kill rule. But yeah, that's pretty much everything I had to say about Born Again. It's great. I feel like the more I read it, the more I get out of it. I think the first time I read it, which was a couple years ago, I thought it was pretty good, but this time around, I definitely got a lot more out of it. But let's talk about how the Netflix series adapted the story. And like I said, it is very loosely adapted, but kind of the skeleton is there. Like Fisk is going after Matt and, tries to discredit Daredevil and everything. I think the big difference here is that he doesn't, Kingpin doesn't really know that Matt is Daredevil until a little later. He kind of pieces it together himself. He's not given that information. And Matt is definitely dealing with some mental health issues, but I think it's mostly kind of emotional in a crisis of faith in the Netflix series, because he's dealing with the death of Elektra and seemingly losing his powers. And in a lot of ways, I kind of feel like the Netflix show did a more interesting job exploring Matt's mental state, even though it wasn't he didn't totally go bonkers like he does in the comic. They kind of explore his crisis of faith and kind of him deconstructing his whole worldview and everything. I found that more interesting than the comic, if I'm being honest. I do want to talk about the similarities. It's mostly like a few scenes that they really ripped right out of the comic. So there's a scene in the show where Matt's placed in a cab by, well, he goes into a cab, but then it turns out that Kingpin tries to fake his, tries to kill him, and that's ripped pretty much right out of the comics, where Matt's put in a taxi by Kingpin and almost killed. And then we see a scene where Matt's laying in the church and healing from his wounds, and it's very similar to the same shot in the Daredevil comic. And the other similarity is Melvin Potter does make that replacement Daredevil suit like he does in the comic, and Sister Maggie's in it, and she's Matt's mom. But I think they explore it a little bit more in the show, which I liked. They explore more like why she left and like Matt's reaction to it and him feeling betrayed and all that. But in the comic, obviously Matt doesn't put on the Daredevil suit until the end. In the show, he doesn't put on the red Daredevil suit at all, but for most of the show, he's wearing kind of a variation of his original homemade suit. And I think the biggest difference here is probably Karen. In the comics, and this is something I found a little bit like I didn't love in the comics, was maybe if I had read, the whole series, all of Frank Miller's run and everything, it would make more sense. But I feel like making Karen like an adult film star and, an addict felt a little bit like edgy, like 80s. Like we got to make everything dark and adult. It kind of feels like a left turn for her character, but maybe it was built up more in the comics that I didn't read. But so yeah, so it's definitely, I felt like that, was a little bit over the top, but also very different from the show. And I definitely prefer the way they do it in the show, because in the show they make this her past. She used to be a drug dealer and an addict, and that resulted in a family tragedy. And I feel like it works better that she had like a bit of a dark past than she just goes down this really dark road. But that's just me. Another big difference is that in the comic, the imposter Daredevil was just this random guy and from a mental institution, whereas in the show it was Agent Ben Poindexter, aka Bullseye. And personally, I think that works a lot better, because he's actually a threat to Matt, whereas like in the comic, the Daredevil overpowers the fake Daredevil pretty quickly because he's just like some random crazy guy. I think in the show worked a lot better because he's actually a threat. He's actually able to imitate Daredevil and like his skills, and he's actually able to, go toe to toe and even overpower Matt. So I definitely, I guess what I'm saying is I kind of prefer a lot of what the show did. That being said, I think the comic is a really good example of kind of the more serious turn in comics where they were kind of going into more adult themes and trying to explore characters more, give them more depth and development, which I think is really great. So, yeah, the comic is really good. It's one of the best from the 80s, and I think the show in a lot of ways expanded upon it and did better in a lot of ways. So, but that's just me. Let me know if you're watching on YouTube. Let me know in the comments what you think of Daredevil Born Again, the comic, and what you think of how the show adapted it. Now, to wrap things up, I'm going to just talk about my cultured picks real quick, which are basically just things I've been reading recently that I think are worthy of note but aren't part of the main book of the week. So, first one is the new new Wolverine series by Saladin Ahmed. Interestingly enough, Saladin Ahmed is also working on the current Daredevil run, but I wouldn't say it's anything like spectacularly, groundbreaking. But there are some interesting things in this new series. Like there's this weird threat that's targeting a bunch of people with adamantium powers or armor or something. I think that's really cool because it's kind of bringing in a bunch of characters that some of them aren't super connected to Wolverine, and a lot of them are, but it's basically just bringing in like everybody who's got adamantium. They haven't done anything with Bullseye. I feel like maybe that would actually be cool if down the line in this series that Bullseye gets involved because he has an adamantium spine, or at least an adamantium grafted spine. But there's that storyline that's been interesting, and there's also this kid, like this teenager that gets turned into a Wendigo, and normally Wendigos are just like these mindless creatures, and Wolverine's fought them a lot. But in this series, this Wendigo kid seems to kind of have some of his humanity left. So Wolverine's been trying to help him out, and I find that I thought that was a pretty interesting take on the Wendigo thing. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens further in the Wolverine series. And then the next thing I wanted to mention is just the Invincible comics, like the whole series. Like, if you're a fan of the show and you like reading comics, I would suggest reading the comic. The show is very accurate in a lot of respects, but I think the comics are different enough that they're worth reading. And I think in a lot of ways the show does a better job with things, but there's some things in the comics that are a little better. But the show just wrapped up season 3. They just did the whole Invincible War and the aftermath. So I would definitely at least suggest reading that if you're a fan of Invincible. I read it a little before season 3 wrapped up, and I think the show did a really good job adapting both in Invincible War and the whole aftermath with Conquest. But yeah, if you're into the Invincible show, want to read the original, I would definitely suggest it. I think it's like 144 or 146 issues, something like that. And so yeah, it's a very complete series. Like, it's obviously long, but it's ended, so it's not like you feel like you have to be like, oh, well, now I gotta catch up to the new stuff. So that is it for this week's show, everybody. Next episode, I will be talking about the Mayor Fisk storyline and talking about Muse. Thank you so much, sincerely, for joining me, especially since I've been gone for so long. If you want to support The Cultured Nerd on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/theculturednerd and look for our show-specific tier. Look for the Cultured Pull List if you'd like to support the Cultured Pull List specifically. And please like and subscribe. If you're listening on a podcast platform, subscribe, give us 5 stars. And if you want to check out the Cultured Pull List on social media, you can scan the QR code on the bottom left if you're watching the video. And you can scan the QR code on the bottom right to check out Casual Experts, which is my personal YouTube and podcast and all that. It's mostly like movie, comic, basically nerd shit commentary. So if you want to check that out, until next time, take care of yourselves and read some comic books.